Hello and welcome to Bits and Atoms, the Grisham Robotics Founder Series. I'm your host, Elias Can, and today I've got Tom Lipinski, founder and CEO of AIRA, joining me. To get started, Tom, would you mind sharing a quick intro about you and AIRA?
Yeah, sure. I'm a repeat founder. I've done several startups before, including robotics startups. I founded AIRA over a year ago, and we're focusing on solving the manual labor challenge with robots.
Very interesting. And you mentioned you've been a founder before. I guess looking back earlier in your time as being an entrepreneur, what kind of originally motivated you to become a founder? What's kind of your origin story?
Yeah, it's a condition. I've always been building things. I've been really bad at sort of following instructions, and I've always felt like, oh, that's a challenge that needs solving, And I remember I filed my first patent when I was like 15, and it got featured in like a national, Mode Technique magazine, and I've always, when I was 17, I sort of half built a car because of like, there's a challenge, there could be a better way of doing it. It's a condition. It's this relentless urge to build stuff and solve challenges, and it's always been like this. So I remember building my own speakers, for example, because I felt like this is not right. It's just this box, it could be done better, and having those big horn speakers built, and then when they sort of work and you go like, oh my god, this works, so it's like a drug, it's this builder addiction that you just have to build stuff and so on. And over time, you kind of learn to put your builder urges into sort of scalable challenges where instead of just building something, you're actually focusing on big challenges that you can build a company around and monetize and so on. Which but the urge never goes away. So it's this thing where you just wake up in the middle of the night thinking there's a better way of doing this, and you just can't stop it.
Yeah, it's a heavy dose of intrinsic motivation to do it. And what I'm curious for, and maybe this is further looking back, and you mentioned, building your own speakers as well growing up, your first patent at 15. With what you've done on the entrepreneur side, I guess, and maybe it stems even earlier, but what kind of how did you find or choose to build in robotics, and maybe hardware more generally? What's kind of the background there?
I sort of fell into this. It was never like a university robotics department and some folks looking at an actuator thinking, oh look, we can commercialize this thing. It was the other way around. I was doing a lot of research in built environment at that point, and I've never had like a linear career. I've been sort of moving dramatically from one side to another, and I was doing a lot of research into built environment and publishing papers on that front, and doing some like retrofit projects in like 2009, 10, and and they got quite a lot of coverage in national press and so on. And we were looking at challenges of making existing buildings more efficient. And being me, I was like, what is the hardest thing, right? And the hardest thing was the floor. Literally, you could like insulate the walls, change windows, change a boiler for a heat pump. All of these things are kind of knowns. But then you look at the floor of existing like old homes, and it's all timber, it's gale blowing through it, and I was like, that is the hardest challenge, because you literally, in order to insulate it, you rip the house apart, right? It looks like it's been bombed after that. And you look at this guy like, well, the only way to do this is to actually get underneath it and then insulate it from below, and it's like this deep, so you can't. So like, well, we have to build a robot. And it was like 2011 when I started playing with this idea of let's build a robot to do it. I got some funding from Innovate UK. And then obviously, what followed was lots and lots of disasters. We literally built a robotics company to solve a challenge that we've had. But we got to a point, when you get to like Mark 7, where your robots work really well. Obviously we've had lots of investment. We've had lots of government funding, which was great. But we got to a point where the technology really worked, whether you were in south of France or in Orkney Islands, and we grew the company to like 4 million revenue. And it was super satisfying because we were actually doing something very meaningful. We were changing people's lives. We insulated over 5,000 homes, and everybody was like, "Yeah, this is the biggest difference." It's made me happy. It's solved. I can finally use the whole house in winter. I don't have to hide upstairs because suddenly it's all warm and comfortable and whatever. Customers telling me like, first we could have Christmas downstairs in our living room. Even though they still had single glazed windows and everything else, because suddenly there wasn't this gale blowing through the house of cold air. So it was really good fun building robotics, but actually what we were doing, we were solving a challenge that only robotics could solve. So it was a technology following an outcome that we wanted to achieve.
Yeah. And I think, that kind of like solving the problem to then get into the space makes a lot of sense. And I see folks kind of follow that path in other industries as well. Obviously, I think versus more like pure play software products that folks will build to after identifying some kind of problem or solving for some kind of use case, it's obviously a much different beast and challenge to build something actually in hardware and robotics versus maybe on the pure play software side. For AIRA today, what are kind of the main use cases for the robots that you're building today? Curious to learn a bit more on what kind of problems you're solving with AIRA.
So we're focusing on what I did say earlier on. It's manual labor. But we kind of flipped from, because my team at AIRA comes from Qbot as well. We sort of moved on to look at what are the really big challenges that we can solve. The downside of Qbot, when you build specialized robotics, right, in a particular vertical, you've got a lot of room to play because it's a small market, but quite frequently you hit the ceiling quite soon, and then you go like, well, I've built this specialized hardware for this application, and suddenly the growth is somewhat limited because it's built for that application. So we sort of flipped it for AIRA and started with what are the biggest challenges, the most, not just biggest from the sort of cost perspective, but also the scalability perspective, where if we solve this challenge, can we solve it? Can we deploy thousands of robots to solve it? So that's number one question. And the number two question was, what is the most urgent challenge that is worth solving? So because you need those two things to, you need a big market, where you can grow into it and scale, and at the same time you need the urgency, the time has to be right. And automotive space, or especially automotive supply chain, seems to be in the right place. First of all, because we can solve a lot of those manual jobs with robotics today, where you pick an item, you have to go somewhere with it, and you place it somewhere. Whether you pick, you can pick it from a conveyor belt, and you have to place it in a particular stillage, or you can pick a dashboard from the rack, and you have to put it on on a fixture, wait for the machine to do its thing, and then you have to pick it up again, walk somewhere with it, put it on another rack. So there's lots of that manual work, which you don't need magical humanoids to solve. You can literally deploy simple wheel-based robots with a couple of arms and grippers, stuff that costs $30,000-$40,000, in China, rather than stuff that's fairy tale, and even if you could buy one that does something, it would cost $250,000, which means there's no point. So so automotive has that space for us to expand into doing those simple mobile tasks where you do some manual handling, you navigate somewhere, and you do some manual handling as well. So that's somewhere where the space is ready from the perspective of practical deliverability, and at the same time, it's a big change for manufacturers to go like, oh, instead of employing people, we need to start employing robots. So you look at what is the where you're getting that huge tectonic shift, right? Which is forcing the market to really adopt something new and take a big risk. And in automotive, that's happening right now. You might not know, but in 2026, 20% of cars sold in the UK were made in China. Yeah. In 2025, 10% of cars sold in the UK were made in China. In 2024, 5% of cars sold in the UK were made in China. You can see where it's going, right? The Chinese-made cars are gaining UK market share 100% year on year, right? That is suddenly, a life-threatening situation for the entire car manufacturing space in the UK, right? 3 out of top 10 cars sold in the UK are Chinese-made. The top-selling car in the UK is Chinese-made, right? That's something that never happened before. So suddenly you've got this entire manufacturing supply chain, not just automotive manufacturers, but the entire supply chain facing existential threat. They are being undercut by Chinese imports, and they can't do anything about it. They can't automate more what they've automated already because all of their production is automated, right? The only cost that's left that they could handle is labor cost, right? And what's happening with labor cost, it keeps going up, You've got higher national insurance that government has introduced. You've got employee charter that government's introduced. You've got minimum wage that keeps going up. So, the costs are going up. So the labor cost, which is the highest cost, right, for these guys, the labor cost is just escalates all the time. And at the same time, you've got imports from China, which are cheaper. So it's like they really stuck between the rock and the hard place, meaning that they are awakening to a possibility of dramatic change, right? So both from the perspective of practical deliverability, because we're not focusing on building humanoids that won't be useful this decade, and we're not busy somewhere else. We're like, let's just show us the job, we'll sort it for you. Okay, so we can do this. A, B, the market is ready because they either adopt what we sell or die. Literally, there was no other option. When you see your competitors going from 5% to 10% to 20% market share, I mean, you can draw a line, right? It ends with your death, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's a perfect spot to enter the market and to really start growing really quickly. So that's why we're focusing on that. And because we've been building robots for like over a decade, so everything, all of that is like, oh yeah, that's just engineering, right? We've done robots, we've done autonomy, we've done teleoperations. So these are solvable things because we're a bunch of engineers. It's about like where is the customer, right? Are they ready to buy? And is this a scalable market? And in this case, we believe we've nailed it with the automotive supply chain.
Very interesting. And yeah, I was thinking about the humanoid side because you get to see these like flashy demos that people will share, but they're probably a little bit more like sizzle reels and less like practical in operation humanoid robots today. And so I like the candid take on your side around that. They're less practical now, and there's more of and there's obviously a clear opportunity right now to do something, but it's more in that like wheeled gripper, less humanoid type of space for robots. And maybe for folks who are watching who are less familiar on like the cost dynamics, what, just in simpler terms, for the labor versus the robot that, for example, that you're doing at AIRA, like what's the multiple cost savings? Is it like a 2x improvement, a 3x improvement? Like, I guess what's the relative cost difference for UK manufacturers in automotive on that side?
There are several wins for our customers, right? I mean, I'll focus on the three because they key wins, right? Number one is you could save your cost up to 50%, right? So you could literally deploy a 50% cheaper labor on your production line at home than what you've been paying so far, right? And that's a huge win. That's cheaper than moving production to Romania, right? If you think about it. The second win is it's infinitely scalable labor force, right? Because once you've trained the robot to do the job, it doesn't matter if it's 1 or 10 or 100, right? It's just, you just deploy more robots, right? You literally call them off and they turn up and they do the job, right? So you can scale that. You don't have labor shortages, and you don't have the training issues because, as I said, you just train one. And a third challenge, which is the flexibility, right? You can scale the production up or down from one day to another, from single shift to 2 or 3 shifts deployment, which means you can be really sort of just-in-time responsive, depending on what happens on your demand side. I mean, I'll give you an example. I'm sure we've all heard when last year Jaguar Land Rover shut down for like over 6 weeks because they had cyber attack, and it took out the entire IT, right? And they couldn't produce cars. They shut everything down. They stopped the entire supply chain, right? So if you think about the Jaguar Land Rover, that's one thing, but actually there was about 1.6, 1.8 billion lost within the automotive supply chain, where people had to pay 3 shifts of folks to sit on their hands while they actually couldn't produce anything. So that's a huge risk. And to be honest with you, people are waking up to the fact that it's not just, you might not get the order next month, or your customer might say, we want 50% next month. They could shut down for a few weeks as they try to, address the cyber attack they've had or any other threat, or you have supply chain issues with, Suez Canal, being shut, or, the Red Sea being shut, or you might have other geopolitical issues. So all of those shocks currently are absorbed by manufacturers who literally have to commit to people to work for them for months and so on. Whereas when you've got robots, you can just go like, oh yeah, next week I want to run 3 shifts or 4 shifts, or 24 hours a day or whatever, and all you have to do is just literally tell us, and we say, okay, well, we're going to run 3 shifts next week, and then that's it, right? And then the week after, we're going to take it down to 1. You pay for what you use, right? So that's the beautiful thing. It completely changes the manufacturing process, right? You don't have to offshore anymore. Suddenly, building things in the UK could be as cost effective as doing it in China with none of that risk, right? And at the same time, you can flex the production up and down depending on demand. You shorten your supply chain, and you do it a lot more, cost effectively. So it really changes the paradigm of manufacturing, and I think it can lead to UK rebuilding its sort of as a manufacturing powerhouse, because the thing that really stifled and killed manufacturing UK was the accelerating labor cost, right? Once you can fix that, you can build at home. Yeah, and this is the big impact that we're trying to bring about.
Yep. And there's always the challenge in more developed economies where some of that manufacturing labor, things like that, becomes a much more shallow talent pool, or like you said, it becomes a bit prohibitively expensive to hire and employ these people. Hence, I mean, the U.S. is no different. Major reliance on China for almost any good you can think of. With I think lately, recently Mexico trying to nearshore some of that as well from the US's perspective, just to kind of like reduce the reliance pure play on China for the most part. And so, yeah, that it makes sense that they would want to kind of like UK as a whole would kind of want to recenter that ability to have local strong manufacturing capabilities back in country, as opposed to always needing to rely or being beaten by competition internationally.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're trying to do.
Yep. And maybe one last question here in a little bit different of an angle, but curious to get your thoughts since you've been on the entrepreneur side multiple times now. What are some of your best strategies or tips on the fundraising side, especially, because you've done it a few different times and in different time periods as well, which I always think is interesting because the market tends to very much ebb and flow in terms of good times to fundraise, bad times to fundraise. Curious to get your thoughts around what's worked well for you, or on the flip side, what you would tell an aspiring entrepreneur today, like totally avoid this if you're going out on a fundraise?
This is a really hard one, because the problem with investment is that it follows fads, right? So, and I don't want to sound dismissive or preachy, but when you look at the VC cycles, right, they come in late in the game and they throw money at companies in fashionable spaces. I remember a huge craze, in I think it was 2009 or something, where everybody in Silicon Valley was throwing money at dog walking apps because everybody wanted to have the next Uber for dog walkers, and these funds just come and go, and now everybody's throwing money at agents, and I know that 90% of those companies that are being super well funded right now and so on will not exist in 3 years' time, because they just wrappers, the LLM costs will go up, and their business model will just get wiped. But they've been, flooded with money because it's fashionable, right? And investors are always the ones that wait until the last moment, and invest late in the cycle, where you've just got this irrational exuberance, and things are going wild and crazy. Whereas the companies that really make it, right, are the ones that nobody buys into at the beginning. If you think about, I don't know, companies that really transform the space, Amazon, Uber, Airbnb, and so on, they were universally hated by investors at the beginning. There was like, what on earth is it, right? But this is a funny story. These are the companies that are literally building something new. They are the winners of tomorrow, but they are the winners of tomorrow because they're doing something completely new and transformative. And this is why you can't wrap your brains around it, right? And this is why, when Airbnb was building their sort of, initial stages, everyone was chasing the dog walking apps because, Sequoia invested in one and we all have to have it now. So if you want to go after investors' money, you actually need to set up a company which is designed to extract money from investors, right? And promise them something that's universally generalizable. It's like, we're building this humanoid that will do everything, and we'll solve everything with this one thing. And, can we have another billion? And investors will put money, will throw money at you like if you were, in Las Vegas strip club. Whereas the companies that will actually survive, whatever happens when we reach the top of the wave here and whatever, are the ones that are building new business models that are focusing on customers, and they're focusing on delivering to those customers. Amazon survived the dot-com crash because they were solving a problem, right? And this is what we're trying to build. We're trying to build a company that solves a problem, and we started with the customer, and we've already got our first contracts, and we've got letters of intent to say we really want to scale this and whatever. But when you're solving a real problem and you're starting with, let's solve this problem, and then we expand into another problem, when you're being appropriate and pragmatic and you're really building hard rather than promising, we're just going to solve cancer with AI, you're not the flavor of the month. So it's I don't know how much overlap there is in between being a fashionable company and well-funded and being a scalable company that has future, right? There might be some overlap, and there may be some companies that navigate that well. I haven't learned how to navigate it. So most of the money that we've received, and we've raised about £400,000 so far, is from angels. And angels are mostly people that have run businesses in the past, and they experience, they kind of get it, right? They haven't just left university, listen to a podcast on investing and suddenly, it's like, I'm going to be a VC type people, right? Whereas VCs, most of them, and I don't want to be dismissive, right? But most of the ones I talk to have never run a business, and they just, there's a criteria that you need to hit, which is different to, we want to build a company, it's like we're looking at, how do we get to $1 billion revenue? We don't look at it as like, oh, how do we get to $1 billion valuations? Actually, no, we going after building a business which is sustainable and can grow. And then people look at us and go like, that's not, you're not building agents. It's like, no, because most people that tell you that build agents, they're just wrappers and they won't be around next year. And we want to be around for another 10. So it's hard. It's about, whatever it is that you're doing, you need to then target the right investors that sort of, go for that space.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you make a lot of good points here. One being that there's definitely a lot of groupthink that tends to be pervasive in the venture community. I've seen that as well in my career. It's, there's things that are, like you mentioned, kind of the hot thing of the year or the cycle, and people will flock to it. And for better or for worse, it's just I think fundamentally a human quality that we do tend to gravitate towards things that are consensus because it's safer than doing things that are non-consensus. But it tends to be the investors who can find the non-consensus opportunities that tend to perform better. And I think you mentioned another really good point too, which is around, building something that's durable versus building something that's flashy. You know, folks can kind of, it's harder to game the durable side, probably a bit easier to game the flashy side. Who's this, like, there's obviously pros and cons to both, and people have found success on both sides. But to your point, if you're not in the kind of like hot target areas for an investor, you're better off looking at that durable, consistent kind of grind to get to somewhere meaningful, as opposed to spinning your wheels to try and just fundraise from VCs, even though you're out of favor in terms of maybe a category that they're looking at.
Yeah, well, I think angels are a good stop, to try. And also, if you've got, like, we've already, the first customer that we just finished onboarding with, they're already like, oh, can we invest? People that understand the value, right, can join you on the journey, and you just, you just keep building, and don't waste your time on people that want. So angels and CVCs, if you're building an industrial space, which is not particularly, our space is quite boring. And if you look at robots we deploy, they literally look like photocopiers with arms, right? So investors would look at it and go like, ugh. But then, we have no pushback when it comes to deployment, right? Because people that work alongside it don't see like, oh, it's a humanoid, it's going to steal my job. No, it's a tool, right? So actually, there are huge advantages of being boring when it comes to adoption rate, when it comes to acceptance, when it comes to other things. But when it comes to raising funding, we probably should have come up with a, and you can see a lot of people do that. They bring over a G1, from Unitree, and it dances, and everybody's like, oh my God, look at it, it dances. It's like, yeah, that's all it does. How many customers for that? So it's, whereas we just look at the job where there's thousand robots to be deployed within the next 3 years. Let's focus on that job. It doesn't dance. It just moves things, boring stuff from conveyor belt to a stillage, and you need to do that 3 shifts in 80 factories. Right? It's like, okay, we get excited about this stuff because that actually solves somebody's big problem.
Yeah, it gets the job done. That's for sure. And with that, we're at time. And so I want to thank you, Tom, for joining me today on Bits and Atoms. It was a great conversation. Really appreciate you sharing your thoughts and experiences here. And I'll let you get back to business. Have a great rest of the day and week.
You too. Thanks, Elias. It was a pleasure.